take your Bible and open it to the 15th chapter of Exodus. And pull that little insert, if you will, out of your bulletin. Been doing a series of studies on facing up to fear. And this morning I want to consider this fear of not having enough. The passage of children of Israel through the Red Sea was an awesome miracle. That they would be able to pass on dry land from Egypt on the west into Sinai on the east through the Red Sea. God stacking up the water, getting them through, and then wiping out the Egyptian army. An awesome thing, and the 15th chapter of Exodus is a song of triumph as they're on the east side of the Red Sea, and the battle of the Egyptian armies are destroyed behind them. But the problem of providing for that horde of men and women and children for the next 40 years is a problem that it geometrically exceeds the issue of getting them across the Red Sea, which is often the case. The most critical issue is not the initial one, the launching point, getting over the launch. It is the whole life that follows, and that was the case here. 3 million of them. According to Exodus 12, there were 600,000 mature men. Now, if you think in terms of a wife for each man, that gives you 1,200,000 adults. If the families were 3 children or so in the family, then you've got 1,800,000 children. Total of 3 million people, which is the most common estimate as to the whole group of the Hebrew people who crossed over from Egypt into Sinai. I did a little arithmetic on that. Suppose that every person were allotted 2 quarts of water a day. Remember, this is desert. That'd be a pretty minimal allotment. 2 quarts of water a day for drinking, washing, little boys have been happy, and preparing food. 2 quarts apiece. You know how much water that would take every day? It would take a tank the size of a football field, 100 yards long, 60 yards wide, and 5 feet deep every day, just to provide 2 quarts of water apiece. Or think about food. If every one of those 1 million people were allotted 1 pound, that's not very much, 1 pound of food for the day, 3 million pounds, 2,000 pounds to a ton, that's 1,500 tons of food. If a boxcar holds, say, 50 tons, that's a 30 boxcar train load every day just to provide a minimal ration to 3 million people. Now that gives you some idea of the problem that they faced for the next 40 years out there in the Sinai desert. Good men are responsible. Good women are managers who care about having enough food and water for their families. Is it any wonder they would have some anxiety as they move into this wilderness? And anxiety flows into complaint and grumbling very easily. And that's a key word that you have here. The fear of not having enough goes all the way back again to our roots in human history. Anthropologists talk about primitive men as being hunters and gatherers. The Bible gives you a picture, the beginning of life, where in the first chapter of Genesis, the very 9th verse, it says, "Let the land produce bounty, vegetation, seed-bearing plants, trees on the land." The 20th verse says, and I like this, "Let the waters teem with life." One of our men said to me this morning, Pastor, I'm going to take you lobstering before the summer is over. Hallelujah! And then I'm going to eat them. But it all goes back to the 20th verse of the first chapter of Genesis. Let the water teem with life, bounty. The 22nd verse, he says to the animals, be fruitful, increase, fill the earth. And the lavish hand of God creates the land and the sea and all that are in them and gives them to the man and the woman. And the 29th verse of the first chapter says, I give you every seed-bearing tree, plant on the whole earth. Every tree that has fruit with seed in it for food, and they'll be yours for food. And then it goes on to say, and God saw it all, that it was good. And creation was bountiful. But then sin came. And there's a curse. In Genesis, the 2nd chapter, the 17th verse, God says to Adam, Adam, the land is cursed because of you. It's going to bring forth thorns and thistles. And in the sweat of your brow, you're going to have to spend yourself to draw sustenance from the land. And it's not going to just give itself to you as it did before sin came in. And therein lies the root of droughts and floods and the plague and erosion and windstorms and hail. And it becomes a world where human beings compete with insects and pests and rodents and rats and woodchucks. But most of all with each other. Because the greatest problem is each other. Feeding the world is not so much a problem of the productive capacity of land and sea, but the distribution of what's available. Problem isn't overpopulation, it's under-distribution. The great migrations of the 19th century that brought a lot of your ancestors' mine over to this country, Scotch, Irish, came not because Scotland couldn't produce the food for them or Ireland couldn't produce the food for them, but because the English landowners had decided that they would rather have that land to grow up to heather so that they could go out in the fall and shoot grouse than to let the historic tenants of the land stay on the land. And so they burned their houses and drove them off, and they came to this country, began over again. That's human nature. The fear of not having enough is another of God's good gifts. It's out of that fear of not having enough that we are driven to put some away, to lay away, to save, to store up, to put back. God put that there. It's a good thing He did. It's the fear of not having enough that will get some of you up tomorrow morning to go to work. Because it would be easier to stay home, sack in. But if you don't go to work, soon won't be enough. And the fear of not having enough gets you to work in the morning. It's the fear of not having enough that keeps you when the lakes and the beaches are calling. But you got to go to work. And it keeps you at it. And that's a gift of God. But the fear that we'll not have enough also can cripple us. It can cripple vision. It can drive to division. It can drive to conflict. Marx was right when he analyzed class warfare and the warfare over things as being at the root of so much of the problems of society. He was wrong about many things, but he realized the problem of the fear of not having enough. It can inhibit us from risking what we need to risk. Shrivel our courage. Keeps churches strangled. Again, I say, I thank God that our church, this church, was willing to step beyond the fear of not having enough, to launch out on doing this expansion or to build this building in the first place. The fear of not having enough can shrivel churches. It can strangle missions. It can blemish the brightest day. It can tarnish the happiest hours. And growing up, I learned the fear of not having enough early. My father had it. Our father had it. My sister, brother-in-law, sitting down here in the second row. I got to be very honest this morning. My sister's here to check me up. She's done it before. But my dad grew up in the Lower East Side of New York City. when he was 13 years old, his father died. His mother went to work scrubbing stairs in office buildings. He quit school, went to work to support the family. 13 years old. That was the only way. He had a younger sister. I remember reading in his journal about a friend, young man who had married and had a young family, died. And my dad wrote in his journal, he said, my friend had no life insurance. What will happen to his wife and children? I mean, this is back in 1917, 18. No, none of the welfare nets underneath the people. Depression. I grew up in the Depression. I remember Dad taking a voluntary salary reduction. Rangeley was a tough place. You know, in those days, they only had 2 months in the summer for the people to earn everything that they needed to earn as far as cash for the year was concerned. And in those 2 months of the summer, they got it and they saved it if they could. And those are hard days because the stock market crash had come, and Rangeley's clientele was pretty much wealthy people. And the New Deal had come, and neither one of them was particularly friendly to them. And so they didn't come, and if they came, they didn't want to spend their money. And I had to be careful about how I played, because if you tear your clothes, clothes cost money, son. Don't rip your pants. And we thought about going out to Aquasic. That's 7 miles, and 7 miles is half a gallon of gas out and a half a gallon back, and that's 18 cents. You've got to think pretty carefully before you drive back there. The curse of my life was that my father's annual life insurance premium came due the same week as my birthday. Yeah, you laugh because you know what the priority was. And I don't think there ever was a child who was more concerned about his father getting his life insurance paid than I was. Times change. The psyche doesn't. Except we use a lot more zeros today to describe both the input and the output. But the fear is the same. How do we handle fear of not having enough? Number one, sometimes God acts in unusual ways. That's why I turn to this 15th and 16th chapters of Exodus, because you've got God acting in an unusual way, and you need to see this. Exodus 15, they've sung this song of victory. They're free, they're bound for the promised land. They stay the first night in the place called Moses' Wells, and it's a pleasant place. And then they go on 3 days' journey to Marah, 23rd verse. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. The Arabs say the water in Marah is the worst in all the Sinai Peninsula. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled. And that word becomes characteristic of the entire wilderness journey. Actually, 2 words here for grumbling. One has to do with the sound, the other has to do with the content. One of the words means to moan, grumble, whine, howl. It can even mean howl. The other word means complaint. Both are used of what they were doing. But as I say, it's easy to go from the fear of not having enough to the whining, the growling, the moaning, the complaining. And that's where they are. The water, don't have it. What are we to drink? And then Moses cried out to the Lord. And the Lord showed him a piece of wood or something that was growing. And he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. I assume it was a miracle. Certainly it was that he threw the right thing in. Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was the engineer who did the Suez Canal and then tried to do the Panama Canal, wasn't successful. Ferdinand de Lesseps tells about the Arabs giving him some acacia wood that they used to sweeten water. But then I'm thinking about a football field full of water 5 feet deep. Man, you'd have to have a brush pile a lot bigger than my brush pile to do it, by some chemical means. Simply a miracle of God. Well, they move on south, on into the Sinai Peninsula, the 16th verse. The whole Israelite community came down through Elim, had a nice stopover in Elim, nice camping place, 12 springs, 70 palm trees, camped there near the water. Then the 16th chapter, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim, came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they come out of Egypt. So it's 30 days now since they've left Egypt. Provisions they brought from Egypt are exhausted. Now, where are they going to find food? The whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Fear of not having enough. And a valid fear. And God hears them. And the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. And on the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that's to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So that's going to be the plan. God says, you're going to see the glory of the Lord, and you're going to know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. That's the 6th verse. Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he's heard your grumbling against him. What a God! He's heard your grumbling. He's going to show you his glory. So there's going to be manna. What's that? Well, they try to find some natural solution for this. The only natural solution that anybody's come up with is that the tamarisk trees out there in the desert, there are certain insects which penetrate the leaves, and then the leaves bleed, and they produce a white, gooey stuff that is sweet and edible. So maybe that's how it happened. The only thing is, they've computed that at the most, those leaves would produce a total of 700 pounds of manna in a season, and it only produces it for 2.5 months in the year. Been pretty short rations for 3 million people. Tamarisk tree didn't do it. It is a deliberate, God-given provision. This manna is like grain kernels. It can be ground in a mill. It can be crushed in a mortar. It can be cooked in a pot. It can be made into cakes. Tastes sort of like honey. Closest thing I can think of is honey grahams. I like honey grahams. I think if I had to eat them for 40 years, morning, noon, and night, I might be a little tired of honey grahams, but I think I'd probably survive on them. I'm sure that it was more edible than that. I'm sure that God had all the nutrients that they needed in it. It was adequate. It was sufficient. And he does it. They go out in the morning, and there it is. The Israelite did as they were told, the 17th verse. Some gathered much and some gathered little. When they measured it by the omer, he who gathered much didn't have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. And they get then a 40-year lesson in trust, in the simplest and most obvious kind of way. In fact, they're instructed in the 17th verse to put 1 jar of this in the Ark of the Covenant once it's built and keep it as a memorial for what's done. Well, that's great. God's never sent manna for me. He does something else, however. 13th verse. He's made a promise that they're going to have meat. And the 13th verse says, that evening quail came and covered the camp. I've never experienced manna, but I have experienced things like quail. See, the quail coming is a natural phenomenon which God times to the right moment. In fact, he's promised that they're going to have meat that night. So it's the timing that is a miracle, and it is the quantity that is the miracle. The quail migrate from the south on up north. They're like snowbirds from Florida. They migrate from the south up to the north, and by the time the day's migration is done, I'm told, they're weary, they land. You can catch them by hand, and that's what happened. So they had meat, a natural phenomenon that God timed, and in the quantity that would do it. Now, I've had quail experiences, and some of you have had too. Noni, I still think about the experience you had when you were at Wheaton, and you couldn't take that exam because you still had a small bill to pay. She was working her way through college, poor as a church mouse, and she still had a bill to pay at the billing office, and they wouldn't let her take the exam until the bill was paid. I think it was only something like $10 or $15, but she didn't have $10, she didn't have $15, whatever it was, and she did what you might expect a young woman to do in that situation. She went down to the women's restroom to cry. And she got down to the women's restroom, and it was closed because they were cleaning it. And she thought, I can't even cry. And she started to walk away from the restroom. The young man who was cleaning it came out and said, are you Nona Peterson? Which was what she was in those days. Are you Nona Peterson? She said, yes. He said, is this yours? And he reached out and handed her a purse. Some months before, it had fallen off the radiator there in the restroom, down behind the radiator. He found it at that moment, handed it to her, and in it was exactly the money she needed to pay her bills so she could go and take the test. Now, that's the quail. Natural answer, the right time, in the right amount. Ask Kevin and Diane about the quail that flew by their place yesterday. He told me about it this morning. Ask them about it. Same thing, the right amount at the right time. God did it. I thought about when Bob and Karen were going to go to Des Moines. We did a very courageous, maybe foolhardy thing when they were about 10 and 11 years old. We were going to let them take the train from Des Moines to Florida by themselves, the two of them, to go down and visit their grandparents. We went through all kinds of rigmarole, signed them up with traveler's aid and all the rest of it. But they had to earn their own money for this. And as I recall, the train fare was about $35 in those days. And I think it was Karen who had done a very good job of working and no, it was Bob, the other way around. Okay, Bob had done a good job of working and saving his money. He had his $35. We had a paper route, Karen didn't have hers. But she went over to Lloyd's supermarket on the other side of the street from our house. And as she was coming back, would you believe there was money blowing in the street? And she picked up $10 bills out of the street. Like a good little girl, she went back to Lloyd's and said, hey, look, I found this out in the street. Do you know who's lost it? They said, no, it's yours. So she brought it home. She had her money for her train fare. Bob was a little jealous. He said, I worked for mine. How come God blew it into you? But you see, quail. God gave her quail. That's how she learned later on when she was in college and said to me, Daddy, don't be worried about next year. Let's see what God will do. God sends quail. He has unusual means of accomplishing his purposes. I could go on and on with illustrations. I think he sent us some quail last week as a church body. Yes, we've known for several months that we'd be receiving a check from the estate of Warren Purley. But last week we received a very generous check from the estate of Warren Purley that makes it, that covers, for example, those room dividers we have to buy for the Family Life Center and to do the adjustments up in room 231 for what we're doing this fall. And it will help us with some other things as well. Because God sent some quail when he knew we were going to need it, right at the right time. Okay, but what if there's no miracle? What if you haven't seen any quail? And you certainly haven't gotten any manna. All right, number one, past provision is still proof of what God is going to do. That's that 8th verse and that 12th verse. you will know that I am the Lord. Interesting, because it's the same word, that word know there, that God uses with Israel with the plagues in Egypt. When he says, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. The Egyptians will know because of the plagues. You will know because of the provision. That's beautiful. You will know that I'm the Lord. So you keep the marker. You keep that jar of manna in the ark. Keep markers. I keep telling you this. Journal. Keep record of what God does. Rehearse it. Talk about it. Remember again and again what he has done. Keep your markers. Past provision is still proof God has a wonderful track record. Review the track record of God. He gives them two tests that that are part of what takes place here. The first is in the 15th chapter. The 25th verse, God is speaking. This is at Marah, where he turned the water so it was sweet and they could use it. It says, the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. What's the decree and the law? Well, this is long before Sinai and the 10 Commandments. Well, the law is this. Israel, here's the law, that in every season, in every seeming impossibility, the Lord will send his deliverance from above, and you can expect him to do it. That's the law. And what goes with it is the right, because you are his people and you are his child. And he says, now, this will be a test for you. The test is that enjoyment is conditioned upon faith. So what do you do if there's no miracle? You follow the lessons you've learned, that God is committed to your provision and that your citizenship is established forever. First test. Am I believing God that he who has been faithful to me in the past will continue to be faithful? Test number 2, in the 16th chapter, the 4th verse. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And in this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. What the grace of God. You talk about an easy test. The test is that every day, every morning, they will go out and pick up manna. They already have plenty of motivation to do it. They're hungry. But also in this, that on the 6th day, you'll pick up twice as much manna. So the test is, will you pick up twice as much on the 6th day? Prepare it so you don't have to cook it on the 7th day, so that you can keep the Sabbath? There's my test for you. In other words, the test is this: will you use what I've given you according to my instruction? Test number 1. Will you believe me on the basis of what I have done in the past? Test number 2. Will you use what I've given you faithfully, obediently to my instruction? What do when there's no miracle? Well, you got 2 tests to pass. When there's no miracle, there are 2 tests to be applied. Do I believe and do I obey? And for 40 years, these will come together. So, when I'm afraid of not having enough, I need to ask myself, enough for what? Enough to live the way I want? Is that enough to feel secure in what I have so I don't have to trust God? Enough to support my self-image so I can buy the threads that will give me the self-image that I want? Enough to satisfy my appetites and fancies? The boat that I'd like? To fulfill my plans? Right? I'm going to have to check to make sure. And when I'm afraid that I might not have enough, I've targeted my enough where God wants it to be. Establish again your baselines. God owns everything. 1 Timothy 6:7, we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we will carry nothing out. That's a baseline. You don't own anything. Secondly, think ahead and avoid the problems. Luke 14:28. Sit down And be sure you've got enough to finish the tower before you start. At least you know where it's going to come from. Set goals and write a budget for getting there. 3, keep good records. Don't be afraid to let your spouse do it if he or she is better at it than you are. And if then they're doing it, you tell them everything they need to know and don't hide anything from them. Give them the information, give them the data. Keep good records. 4, know what's going on, what you've got, how much you owe on your credit cards, how much you're paying for interest on them, what the carrying charges are, what you've got in your checkbook. If you're not balancing your checkbook, you are not being a faithful Christian. Did you hear me? If you're not keeping track of your ATM withdrawals, you are not being faithful to the Lord. Good stewardship keeps good records. And finally, reckon with God's partnership in everything. Don't be sloppy. Seek His counsel. Be honest. Give God His part. Put trust into action. That's where, giving God the first fruits, giving Him the 10th off the top, becomes critically obedient. That all has to do with, am I doing what He wants with what He's given me? If my fear is that I'm not going to have enough, I have 2 tests. 1, am I believing God? Number 2, am I doing what He's told me with what I do have, what He's given to me? Am I obedient with what I've got? Fred Smith, businessman from Texas, says a prerequisite to spiritual maturity is learning to give. When we ask people to give, we're not asking them to do God a favor. We're just asking them to be faithful. Well, let me just conclude with this. I said I've never experienced manna, the supernatural food from heaven. But I had to stop and rethink that. Because in John the 6th chapter, they were coming to Jesus and they were saying, give us bread, like Moses gave them bread. And Jesus said, I am the bread from heaven. One day He would take a loaf and He would break it and He would say, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And I realize that I have indeed been fed on manna, the supernatural bread of God, which the Father gave to me when He gave His Son Jesus Christ into this world to die for me. And that Son of God, by His death for me, has given me eternal life, and I will belong to Him forever because of the bread of God. And I have eaten that bread when I opened my life to Jesus Christ and became His child. And suddenly I realized that I cannot separate confidence in the bread for my body from confidence in the bread for my soul. And that the God who gave His Son Christ for me, whose Son said, I am the bread of life, is the God who has also taught me through His Son to pray, give us this day our daily bread. I cannot separate my confidence in the provision of God for my daily needs from my confidence in God for my eternal salvation. If I waver in my confidence that He's God of the manna for my body, I really have inadequate faith that He's the God of bread for my body, and vice versa. Let me close with this. In my devotions this week, I came to the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians. And I was struck by something that had never really impressed me before. But you know how God just takes something that fits the very moment and the very need and squeezes it into your soul. I was reading Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 12, where he talks about the tremendous blessings of God in his life. And he says, in fact, the blessings were so great that God had to send a thorn in the flesh to me lest I become conceited. And that's the word, 7th verse, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surprisingly great revelations. Paul says, I'm a sinner. God has blessed me. The very multitude of his blessings could become sin in my life as I become conceited because of all that God has given me. God, knowing my vulnerability to sin, gave me this thorn in the flesh in order to keep me dependent and humbled before him. And Paul says, and I asked God 3 times to take that away from me, and he didn't. But his answer was, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, because my strength is made perfect in your weakness. And I've always read that. My strength is sufficient for you. I'll give you what you need. And I suddenly saw that this week. No, he's saying, Paul, I know you're vulnerable to sin. And I know that what's going on in your life right now may in some ways reflect that vulnerability to sin. But Paul, I want you to know, my grace is sufficient for you. And vulnerable to sin or not, tarnished by your inadequacies or not, stained by the taint of sin in your life, nonetheless, my grace is sufficient for you. And my strength will be made perfect in your weakness. So even when my fear of not having enough is in part an expression of my awareness of the guilt and sinfulness of my life, even then the word is, my grace is sufficient for you, because my strength is made perfect in your weakness. That's the good news for today.